Canada released its national greenhouse gas inventory for 21 a few days ago, and really not any surprises. Basically, the national numbers changed only a little bit, and as per usual, Alberta dominated the inventory. Makes up about 26% of national greenhouse gases, even though it only makes up 12% of the population. And so I'm going to talk to journalist Shawn McCarthy about that. Welcome to the interview, Shawn.
Thanks, Markham. How are you today?
I'm just fine, thank you. So Canada clearly has an Alberta problem when it comes to GHG reductions. And you and I were talking about how economist Jason Dion has done a study in which he talked about safe bet decarbonization technologies and wildcard technologies. And you thought that was a good application in Alberta's case, or good explanation for what Alberta is trying to do. Could you explain that, please?
Sure. So the Institute for Climate Choices that Jason Dion works for produced this report, and it basically laid out pathways. How do we get to net zero by 2050? Looking at the shorter term, there are some technologies, some what he calls safe bets, energy efficiency, greening the electricity grid with renewables, electrification of the vehicle fleet with zero emission cars, and so on. And those are absolutely required to get us first to 2030 targets, and then on the road to 2050. And you don't get to 2050 without really significant improvement by 2030. The longer term bets, what Jason called wildcards, are big capital, not quite ready for prime time. They're not really commercial yet. Hydrogen is a big one. Carbon capture, use, and sequestration is another big one. Small modular reactors is another important one. And these aren't, he calls them wild cards, but he also says that over the longer term, these are technologies that are going to be required to get us to 2030, to 2050 in particular. But that you can't rely on them because we don't know. You can't rely on any one of them because we don't know whether it's going to be successfully commercialized or not. Hydrogen, a lot of interest in hydrogen. A lot of questions remain about the lack of infrastructure and the enormous amount of capital that has to be deployed to get that going. Alberta, in its strategy, and it's starting to take shape, and we're seeing more, I would say, more action from Alberta in some of these areas, but it's a lot of it is geared towards those wild cards. So, we saw a hydrogen strategy. We see them looking at carbon capture. We've even seen them expressing interest in the SMR. So I think, progress there, but not so much on the other shorter term agenda.
Well, Shawn, oil and gas production makes up about 3/4 of Alberta's emissions, and the oil sands alone are 10 or 11% of national emissions. So the oil and gas industry has to be a particular focus here. And having interviewed a lot of people in the industry and covered this for years, my take on this is that basically the industry is not going to make any investments in radical reductions in green GHGs in the short term. A company like Cenovus, for instance, said, well, maybe by 2030, we can stop the growth of our emissions, and then we'll see what happens after that. And so when I look at Alberta's strategy of hydrogen, carbon capture, and SMRs, it kind of mirrors the industry's approach. Well, we'll bet on stuff that may come in 10 or 20 years, but for now, it's kind of stay the course. Would you agree with that or disagree?
Well, I think stay for the industry. I think stay the course is. I'm not sure I would. I'm not sure I would term it that way. I do think there has been significant investment in reducing the carbon intensity of the barrel, but they want to also increase the production. So you end up with a wash, right, in terms of the overall impact. But investments are getting made, and the more that we see carbon price and the more that we see regulation and the more that we see international financial markets demanding it, I think some of that investment will ramp up. But, it is evolutionary, not revolutionary. It will bring down the intensity. But if you're only going to deploy capital to improve intensity on new production, that's going to add more oil to the system. Again, it's hard to see, as you said, Cenovus is talking about flatlining, not reducing their overall emissions, even as they bring their intensity down.
Now, is this going to eventually lead to more conflict between Alberta and the federal government and the Premier Jason Kenney and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and possibly even other provinces like BC and Quebec, which are more aggressively pursuing electrification of their economies? I hear grumbling outside Alberta all the time, which is along the lines of, why should we bring our GHG emissions down, and Alberta makes no or little effort. They need to bring it down proportionally in that province. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that there is a certain element of grumbling, as you put it, that other provinces don't want to have to make up for Alberta's laggard approach in order for Canada to meet. I mean, we're talking about 30%. Now we're talking about governments aiming for 40%. I just heard somebody in a conference today talk about Canada should be aiming for 50% reduction by 2030. So, ambition is expected to be heightened, not lessened. And yes, I think there's a fair amount of tension in the federation over this. Alberta, I do think that the feds are looking for places where they can work with Alberta, and particularly on these bigger capital, CCS, CCUS, and hydrogen, where they can work with Alberta to try and make it a reality. But at the same time, it'd be great to see Alberta step up with a serious energy conservation program, which they scrapped when the UCP government came in. Some effort to move people off high emitting vehicles, which a lot of provinces are offering incentives for that. There's a whole range of policies that Alberta could be adopting that go beyond these big industrial kind of efforts, rather than simply relying on a federal carbon tax, which they continue to rail against, even though they lost in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it is at first blush a very curious approach by Premier Kenney, because doing those kinds of things, you think, would at least in part get the feds off his back, because the federal government is basically saying, we have a backstop for everything, and if you don't do something, we will move in and do it for you. And so that might be, get the Alberta partway and build a working relationship with the federal government. They have no interest in doing that. I suspect it's because their base in Alberta is really antithetical to that. There's a lot of opposition, amongst the conservative voters. And Kenney, some would say he panders, but that's politics, right?
Right.
What's your take?
Right. That is politics, and we've seen him turning himself into a pretzel over COVID, and this is a similar kind of situation where a good portion of his electoral base is really opposed to these things. The other thing I would say, in Alberta's defense as well, is they ran into a heck of a storm in terms of their finances as oil prices were knocked down. Starting in 2014, and then of course with COVID, and so an effort to get your deficit under control, spending on things like energy conservation, I guess not that surprising that they see that as something that can go, but you have to have a longer term view, and energy conservation in particular can pay for itself, not so much there are ways to finance energy conservation that may not have to have a huge impact on the fiscal situation in Alberta if you can make it in low interest loans or what have you. Anyway, I do think it is the financial situation in Alberta has been part of the driver, as well as the political opposition to climate change action overall.
Now, the rumors are that the Trudeau Liberals are gearing up for an election. They're a minority government, and so we'll probably have one before the regular 4-year cycle. That's history would suggest. Do you think that Justin Trudeau will wait until after the election, hoping for a majority, before he gets a little tougher with Alberta, or is it in his best interest to get tough now and be seen to be, active on the climate file in other provinces?
Well, I think the latter, and getting tough even after a majority. It's going to be interesting to watch them try and square the circle here. I just listened to Seamus O'Regan, the Natural Resources Minister, and he talks all the time about the need to bring the oil-producing provinces along with us, and the oil, the people who work and live on the industry, to bring them with us, and he's very adamant about that. I think it would be hard to overestimate the impact that being shut out in Alberta and Saskatchewan had after the 2019 election, and the concerns about fracturing the federation by having a government that has no representation on the prairies. And I think they're very concerned about that, and should be. This country is very hard to govern, and driving difficult policies through when you have no representation and no credibility in the constituency is really fraught.
Shawn, thank you very much for this. Appreciate the insights.
Thanks, Martin.